Hello. As always, I want to thank you for tuning into this Bible study. Today we're going to be covering the rest of Genesis 29 as well as all of Genesis 30. We've got a lot of ground to cover. As a recap, we're talking about Jacob. Jacob, whose name means heel snatcher as well as deceiver. In Genesis 27, we see him swindle his brother Esau out of his birthright in exchange for some stew, which is, more Esau's mistake than Jacob's, but whatever. But then we also see Jacob deceive his father, lie to his father on his deathbed to be able to get his, well, technically it wasn't his deathbed. He doesn't die for a while, but Isaac thinks that he's dying. At any rate, Jacob lies to his father multiple times and deceives him by putting on animal skin on his arms. His father is blind at this point and steals his brother's blessing, his final patriarchal blessing from his father, because his father touches the animal hair and thinks that it's his hairy brother Esau. So he steals the blessing. He gets run out of town basically by Esau, who's trying to kill him. But just before he leaves, Isaac prays a blessing on him that God would extend to him the same blessing that God gave to Abraham. It's an extension of the Abrahamic covenant, that Jacob would be in the same way that Isaac was blessed through the Abrahamic covenant. Isaac then is asking that Jacob would be blessed through that covenant. And we see in Genesis 28, we see that happen. We see Jacob, well, we don't see it happen, but we see a reaffirmation of that covenant. So this is what we talked about last week, was Jacob's ladder, where Jacob has this dream in which he sees this stairway, and he sees angels ascending and descending this stairway that goes up into heaven. And we talked about the fact that that's actually a picture for Christ, and that through Jesus, Jesus is our stairway that bridges the gap between the fallen earth that we're in and heaven through the sacrificial death that Jesus did on the cross. And we spoke about that last week. But then at the very end of last week, we saw Jacob arrive in Padan Aram, which is the region, and specifically Haran, which is in modern-day southeast Turkey, north of Syria. And that's where he meets Rachel, who is a shepherdess at this point. And that's where we pick it up. So why don't you bow your heads, let's pray, and then we're going to dig into the scriptures. Lord, thank you. Please speak through me. Please let these be your words. Please teach us about your character, about who you are, and about your forgiveness and grace. As we look at how you bless Jacob despite the situation. We love you, Lord. Praise you, Lord. Amen. Okay, so we're going to break this up into chunks, and the first chunk that we're going to cover is verse 14 through 30 of 29. As I mentioned, we already covered the first 14 verses last week. So picking it up on verse 14, because it cuts right in half in the subject of verse 29. After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel. But they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is completed and I want to make love to her." So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years. The deceiver is deceived. So there's lots of stuff to talk about here. One of the things that we're going to see today that is very evident is a difference in cultures. Historical, cultural context we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the difference in marriage. We're going to talk about the difference of value of women and childbearing. These are all things that we're going to see when we dig into both 29 and 30. So first elements to talk about here. Weak eyes. So verse 17. So Jacob arrives in the beginning of 29. Jacob arrives in Haran, and he sees Rachel, and he's instantly in love. And then goes and sees Laban. Laban is his uncle, his mother's brother, and he's in love with Rachel, and he stays there for a month, and he says, "I want to marry your daughter Rachel." Laban says, "Work for me for 7 years, and she can be your wife." So we'll talk about this in a second, but as we go through these different elements, I want to hit it in chronological order when we hit it. Verse 17, Leah had weak eyes. The other translations that I have, so the word here is rak, R-A-K, is the English of the Hebrew, but it's rak is the Hebrew word, means weak, tender, delicate, or gentle. The New Living Translation translates this sentence, Leah had no sparkle in her eyes. So Rachel's the pretty one, and Leah's not so pretty. When I read this, I honestly see it as, you haven't met a person, and you ask, well, what does she look like? Is she pretty? She's got a great personality. And I feel like that's kind of the idea that is being said here about Leah. Poor Leah. Leah has a tough rap. We'll get back and talk about that here in a minute. But so we see the marriage agreement, verse 18 and 19, the marriage agreement. Okay, so marriage at this point, you didn't have a religious ceremony. You didn't go to the temple at this point because the temple hasn't even been built. The tabernacle hasn't even been established. The Levitical priesthood isn't even set up yet. Marriage at this point was a contract, and it was much more about wealth and continuing the family line and the culture and maintaining the culture, which is why Abraham, when he was dying, sent his head servant back to his hometown to get a wife, Rebekah, for his son Isaac, who is Jacob's parents. In the same way, Isaac then pleads with his son Jacob to go back to Haran to get a wife so that they didn't have a diluting of the culture with the local Canaanite women. So marriage contracts were really important, and it was very much a purchase. It is a contract. It is an agreement that's made. It was often made between the two fathers, or in some instances, the oldest son, which Laban is a good example. Laban does the contract for his sister Rebekah and her being married to Isaac. That's not, it's he's the eldest son in the family, so he actually does the negotiation. Well, Jacob in this situation, he's all alone. We know that he is going to get the inheritance that is guaranteed to him, but his father Isaac is still alive, and his brother Esau wants to kill him. So he has nothing. He has no possession. He also has no one to negotiate for him. His dad isn't there to do the negotiation of the contract. And so he just sees Rachel. He has nothing to offer. So Laban takes advantage of the situation and says, work for me for 7 years, which we'll discuss here in a second, was an extremely high price to pay for Rachel. But Jacob's in love, and he says, okay, that's fine. And we see here where it went by very, very quickly. I want to read the NIV application commentary. It has some context to give to us, page 586, on this subject. The agreement reached between Laban and Jacob is intended to provide for the bride price. That was an essential part of a marriage contract. This was a payment made from the groom or his family to the family of the bride. Its function was to serve as a trust fund of sorts to provide for the support of the wife should the husband divorce her or die. In text from Nazi, the typical bride price was 30 or 40 shekels. Since a shepherd annual's wages was 10 shekels a year, Jacob, in effect, is paying a premium by working 7 years for her. But he is not in a position to negotiate. Theoretically, Laban will garner Jacob's would-be wages and secure them into a bride price account of some sort. Marriage customs in the ancient Near East combine legal and festive elements in different ways from current Western practices. The legal aspect did not feature a formal ceremony by a licensed cleric or public official. Instead, it was reflected in a private marriage contract drawn up by the families involved. Such contracts did not depend on the agreement of the bride and the groom, and sometimes were made while they were still children. When the agreed upon time arrived, a marriage feast was held to honor the couple. It included a ritual, celebratory meal, and concluded with the couple retiring to consummate the marriage. This is interesting. Even after the feast, the bride continued to live in the house of her father for several months and receive conjugal visits. Often the conception of a child signaled the time for the couple to begin their own household. I read another context which actually said that in some cultures at this time, they weren't even considered married until the bride actually conceived a child. So if you were married over a certain period of time and no child came, that husband could actually divorce the woman because she wasn't able to conceive. Now, obviously in science today, it could be either his problem or her problem, but whatever. The point being is that marriage was so critical about having children that it was even defined, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'll do another reference as we go later on, is that the marriage wasn't even really defined until a child was in the mix. Interesting stuff. Absolutely interesting stuff. So Jacob works for 7 years, and then they have the wedding feast. So verse 22 is when we get into the feast. Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. Now, it lasted a week. And we see that from context in verse 27 and 28, in which the daughter's bridal week, and Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah. The celebration was a week. It was a lot of different festivities, but oftentimes this celebration and coming together would lead to drunkenness. Now, we have no context to know if Jacob is drunk. Leah, so he's supposed to be marrying Rachel, right? And the bride throughout the entire process that day is veiled. So you wouldn't know whether it was Rachel or Leah. But that evening, the first night ends with the consummation, and Jacob doesn't realize that it's not Rachel and that it's Leah. Now, again, we don't know for certain if he's drunk or not, but it is an explanation that would explain why in the morning when he wakes up, he's totally surprised because it's the older, weak-eyed Leah that he has spent the night with and has married, and he's livid. He's livid. We see this. What is it that you have done? Why have you done this to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? Laban, his response, they made a contract, they made an agreement, and Laban broke it. But his response is simply saying, it's not in our custom to give the young daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week. So finish the celebration this week. Then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work. Jacob loves Rachel and is willing to deal with this situation so that he can have her. It's just ending this week. Then he's able to actually have her as his wife, and then together they can complete the additional 7 years. And that is exactly what happens. Now, we have Rachel and Leah, but as you noticed, one line after each of them is said after they were given in marriage, Laban gave a steward, a maidservant, a slave to each of them to be their attendant. Bilhah and Zilpah are the two that were given. Zilpah was given to Leah, and Bilhah was given to Rachel. And we'll see as we continue on that all four end up being Jacob's wives. And this is where we get the 12 tribes. The 12 sons that he's going to have between these four different women become the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's what we're going to get into. I want to just pause just real quick for a second and just imagine how Leah felt. I honestly feel for her. I mean, her dad tells her, we're going to deceive Jacob. You are going to marry him. Leah obviously knew that Jacob had no idea. Leah obviously knew that she was being being forced to marry him. Things have changed, and I'm very grateful that they have changed. This is not an endorsement of the Bible for this sort of treatment for women. This is a statement of the culture at the time. And as you study Christianity, wherever Christianity is and is prominent, women feel freedom and have expanded their freedom in the ability to vote, in the ability to be able to be completely independent as they are today. And there are still places, unfortunately, in which women are treated like this. And that is really unfortunate, but it's growing lesser and lesser. Total tangent. Just had to say, my heart goes out for Leah in this situation. Okay, so now we're going to read chapter 29, verse 31 through 24. So picking it up on 29:31. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too." So she named him Simeon. Again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Now at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons." So he was named Levi. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children?" Then she said, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son." Because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won." So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "What good fortune!" So she named him Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "How happy am I! The women will call me happy." So she named him Asher. During the wheat harvest, Reuben went into the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" "Very well," Rachel said. "He can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went to meet him. "You must sleep with me," she said. "I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he slept with her that night. God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, "God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband." So she named him Ishkar. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, "God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor because I have borne him 6 sons." So she named him Zebulun. Sometime later, she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, "God has taken away my disgrace." She named him Joseph and said, "May the Lord add to me another son." Okay, so we see here the value of a woman at this time is the ability to bear children. And you can see that based on just how these two, how Rachel and Leah are battling over who can produce children for Jacob. And we see evidence of Jacob's relationship with Leah in the names of the children, in what she calls. Clearly, she's not happy with this situation. Jacob's forced into it, but he clearly doesn't love her. He loves Rachel, but as we read, God sees how Leah is treated and opens up her womb, and she has all these children. And then eventually Rachel is getting fed up and even says to Jacob, "Give me children or I will die." And Jacob's like, So then we see what happened with Abraham and Sarai. Abram and Sarai did the same practice, as you recall. I'm jumping ahead here in my notes, but in Genesis 11:30, we'll get back to that in a second, but in Genesis 11:30, the same practice was done. Sarai, Abraham's wife, wasn't able to conceive. She was totally barren, and they tried for years and years and years and years. And eventually Sarai says, "You know what? Why don't you marry my maidservant Hagar, and you can continue the line through her." As we talked about with that study, this was a cultural practice at the time. And it's clearly evident because Rachel can't have any kids, and so she gives Jacob in marriage her maidservant and has 2 children by her. Then Leah does the same thing, gives her servant to Jacob. They have 2 children. Then God sees and hears and remembers Rachel's cries and her prayers and answers them, and she finally has a son, and that is Joseph. So let's go through these 12 children. Now, we've only listed 11, but I'll hit on that. Firstborn is Reuben to Leah. The name literally means "he has seen my misery." Simeon is next, also born to Leah. "One who hears" is the name. Levi is the next, the third, and that means attached. In the tribe of Levi, these are the 12 tribes, right? In the tribe of Levi, descendants from Levi are both Moses as well as John the Baptist are from the tribe of Levi, as well as all the Levitical priesthood are descendants from Leah and Jacob's son Levi. Then you have Judah, whose name means praise, also born to Leah. And for you Bible students out there, who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah? That's none other than Jesus. Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Jesus is a descendant of the tribe of Judah, as are King David as well as King Solomon. Then you have Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid, who has 2 children, Dan, which means vindication. Samson is a descendant of Dan. Then you have Naphtali, whose name means my struggle. Then we have Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, and there's 2 children by Zilpah. Gad, which means good fortune, and Asher means happy. Then we have the mandrake incident, which I'll talk about here in a second. Real interesting stuff. And then Leah has two more sons, Ishkar, which means reward, and Zebulun, which means honor. And then there's a daughter that's born in the mix, Dinah. And finally, Rachel has her two sons, Joseph, which means may he add. Her prayer was that she would have a second son, and she does, not until Genesis 35:18, but that's Benjamin. And from the tribe of Benjamin, we get King Saul as well as the apostle Paul is a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin. These are the 12 tribes. They will, before we get to the end of Genesis, the 12 tribes will go down to Egypt. And in Egypt, they each become a mighty family. Then you have Exodus. And in Joshua is when we see Israel, the 12 tribes, come back to the promised land. And we see the land divided up based on the tribes. And interesting things that happens, and then I'll continue on in talking about on our text and leave the tangent of the tribes, but I just want to hit on this just real quick. Interesting element. You have the 12 tribes, right? When it comes to the land division, Levi, the tribe of Levi, is set apart as the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood. The Leviticus is all about the role that the Levite, the Levitical priest, had in the tabernacle temple system. So they weren't given land, so that brings it down to 11. But Joseph, who we'll talk about, has two sons, and his two sons become part of the 12 tribes. So you have Manasseh. When you look at the division of the land, Manasseh is mentioned. And then Ephraim, when Joseph, the tribes of Joseph are mentioned, it's in reference to Ephraim. In Revelation 7, 4 through 8, we have the 144,000 Jews from all 12 tribes that are going to be sealed. This is end times. This is in the midst of the tribulation. We have 12 tribes, 12,000 from each tribe. But interestingly enough, Levi is mentioned at this point, the tribe of Levi, but Dan, the tribe of Dan, is not mentioned. And if I do a talk on Revelation, I'll talk about why. Different scholars have different theories about what that is. But we do see Manasseh, Joseph's son, the tribe from Manasseh is mentioned, and then Joseph is mentioned, which we know means that's a reference to the tribe from Ephraim, and we get that from Numbers 1, 32 through 33 as a reference to say that when Joseph is mentioned, it's actually talking about Ephraim. I say all that to say the 12 tribes are here established as these 12 sons. Again, Benjamin hasn't been born yet, but he will be soon. And this you see God's fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant of becoming a mighty nation. Okay, what's up with the mandrakes? What is going on here? What is a mandrake, right? So this is in chapter 30, verse 14 through 17. During the wheat harvest, Reuben, who is Leah's son, went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel says to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. And Leah is not willing to. So then you have this negotiation in which clearly Rachel still controls Jacob's bedroom activities, because she then Rachel negotiates with Leah, give me some of those mandrakes, and in return, you can sleep with Jacob tonight. So clearly, Rachel's in charge, so to speak, in that regard. But what's going on with these mandrakes? Mandrakes are a plant, which I have a description, which I'll read here in just a second, but it's a flowering perennial plant that has a pungent smell, and it was thought to help with fertility as an aphrodisiac, but also to help with barren women to be able to get pregnant. Rachel wants desperately to have a child. We'll talk about why here in a second when we get into 25 and on. We'll talk about why it is. One of the reasons, obviously, is that her value, unfortunately, is linked to her being able to provide children. So there's a superstition. There is this belief that mandrakes allow you to be fertile. And so she finds out that Leah's son has found some mandrakes and she wants them, so she negotiates. so that Leah can then sleep with Jacob that night. And from that, Leah gets pregnant again, which no doubt upset Rachel. But let me just read, just as a reference, just real quick, the commentary on that. So Zondervan Illustrated Background Commentary, page 108, talking about mandrakes. Mandrake plant. The usual identification of this plant is mandragora, frequently believed in the ancient and classical world to possess magical properties, primarily as an aphrodisiac with the power to make a barren woman conceive. In Egypt, it appears to be the aroma that had the erotic powers. Modern study has confirmed that the fruit is a sedative and a narcotic. So that is what she negotiates to be able to receive. Continuing on, oh yes, I did want to mention just one thing, barrenness. We spoke about this when we were talking about in Genesis 25 with Rebecca not being able to conceive. And it's an interesting element when you look at it. All of the matriarchs, the mothers of the passing on of the Abrahamic covenant, were barren. Sarai was barren. We get that from Genesis 11:30. Sarah was barren. Rebecca was barren. Genesis 25, verse 20, as well as 26. The reason why we know this, it took 20 years for them to be able to conceive, and it was only after Isaac prayed for his wife. And in chapter 25, it specifically says that God heard his prayer, and Rebecca became pregnant. God intervened. Then in Genesis 29:31, Lord saw how much Leah was not loved. In fact, one translation, the ESV that I read, even said that Leah was hated. That because Leah was hated, God remembered her, and she became fertile. And then in Genesis 30:22, God remembers Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. The point that I'm getting at is that every single one of these women was not able to conceive. The only one that we don't know if it was the man or the woman was actually between Rebecca and Isaac, because they only have the one set of kids. But we know that Abraham was certainly able to conceive because he had Hagar. And then we know that Jacob is fertile. We know that for certain. The point being, God's hand is clearly at work here. God wants it to be known that it wasn't through human endeavor that the line was continued, but through his hand and his blessing. It's a big point to remember. As a side note, does this mean that barrenness is 100% caused by God? No. We are in a fallen world. In the same way, when you get cancer, it doesn't mean that God is judging you. When you are barren, it doesn't mean that God is judging you and that you are only able to conceive when God gives you that blessing. There may be situations in which you do need to pray, and then after you pray, you will be able to conceive. That is, I have no idea in what the situation is. I do know we are in a fallen world, and there is sickness and there is disease. And the one thing I do know for certain, if you are trying to conceive and you are not able to, God is with you. God feels the pain you're going through. He intimately knows the emotions that you're feeling. Pray about it. Submit to God. Present it before God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will be yours. Doesn't mean that God's going to give you exactly what you want. It very well might be that God has something else in plan for you. Maybe you're supposed to adopt. Maybe you're not supposed to have kids. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that God is with you and understands what you're going through. Put your weight on that. I just wanted to say real quick that this is not a biblical precedence to say anybody who's not able to have kids is because God's preventing you from doing that. I hope that's clear. Okay, one more thing that I want to mention, the reversal that's here, it's interesting. The masquerade, right? We see Laban do a total masquerade in hiding Leah as Rachel. The exact same thing happened to Jacob. Jacob was the one doing the deception when in Genesis 27, Jacob deceives his father Isaac by saying that he is Esau, putting on Esau's clothing, putting on the animal skin to take on the personality of Esau to get the blessing. Well, now the same thing happens to him. Also, we see a trade for food. In Genesis 25, Esau comes back starving. He's starving for food. He's been out hunting for days, hasn't eaten anything, comes back. Jacob is cooking up some lentil stew, and Esau says, I'm starving. Give me that red stew. And Jacob says, sure, I'll give it to you for your birthright, for your inheritance. Give me your inheritance, and I'll give you the stew. And Esau, for a pot of stew, gives up his birthright. In the same way, we actually see the same thing happen where Leah negotiates with Rachel for the mandrakes, for this food, in order to be able to sleep with Jacob. Jacob was a pawn, Esau was the pawn that Jacob used, and in this situation, Jacob is the pawn being tossed around. Ironically, in this situation, Leah ends up conceiving because of Rachel's negotiation. Just think it's interesting to see the parallels between Genesis 27 and 29 as it relates to the deception, and Genesis 25 and Genesis 30 as it relates to the food trade. Okay, so as we wrap up, we're going to now read our last chunk, and that is the rest of chapter 30, picking it up on verse 25. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you. But Laban said to him, if I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. He added, name your wages and I will pay them. Jacob said to him, you know how I have worked for you, and how your livestock have fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household? What shall I give you? He asked. Don't give me anything, Jacob replied, but if you will do this one thing for me, I will go tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages, and my honesty will testify for me in the future, whenever you check on the wages you have paid me. Any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, I will be considered stolen. Agreed, said Laban. Let it be as you have said. That same day, Laban, he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob. While Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks, Jacob, however, took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made white strips on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they made it in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the speckled or dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made a separate flock for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. What is the deal with putting sticks in the water and having that change their fur? We'll talk about that in a second, but let's go through this. The first thing that I want to hit on is right at verse 25. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me on my way. This is what we talked about earlier. Technically, Jacob couldn't leave with Rachel because she hadn't actually conceived any kids yet. And so if Jacob were to go to Laban and try to say, hey, send us on our way, Laban would have valid argument to say, no, you can't leave. She's not technically your wife fully yet. In fact, I want to read one more piece from the Illustrated Bible Background Commentary, specifically on having kids. After Rachel gave birth, chapter 30, verse 25, a woman's status in the marriage was not fully attained until she bore a son. In some contracts from the second millennium, a time limit is set after which she can be divorced should an heir not be provided. Prior to Joseph's birth, it would have been inappropriate for Jacob to leave with Rachel since her status would be more secure with family in the area. Interesting stuff. It is unfortunate, but the value was very much based on the ability to be able to have children. And as we've discussed, you see the battle between Leah and Rachel validates that. Okay, another interesting thing that I want to hit on. So they're talking about wages, of what his wage will be. And Laban says in verse 27, if I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Then Jacob says in verse 30, the little you had before has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. So we see from this, Laban is using divination. Now, I want to just hit on the Dictionary of Old Testament, specifically for the Pentateuch. Amazing resource if you want to dig really, really deep. I'll put all these references in the notes on YouTube. But divination, as defined in this book, magic. Divination and magic were widely practiced in the ancient Near East and are vigorously condemned in the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Torah. And throughout the Bible, let me read that again. Divination and magic were widely practiced in the ancient Near East and are vigorously condemned in the Pentateuch and throughout the Bible. The practices overlap in many important ways and have similarities with prophecy and religion, which makes it difficult to clearly distinguish between them. All involve interactions with supernatural beings or powers. While the Bible prohibits divination and magic, some permitted practices share common features. On the other hand, approved practices such as prophecy and prayer or the laying on of the hands, those were done in both, are denounced when practiced with a magical mindset. For these reasons, descriptions of the methods involved are not enough. One must also consider the beliefs, motivations, and practices of the practitioner's worldview. Context is critical. So the point being is that Laban does not give God glory or credit for the wealth that he has gained, but quickly Jacob does give God credit, saying that it's not by some magical thing that this has happened. The Lord has blessed you. Then we get to this question about the speckled animals, right? What is this? What is going on here? Scientifically speaking, there is no basis here for a scientific proof where if you take certain branches, peel the bark back so it's striped, put it in water, then an animal drinks from it, and then that animal will then be striped. This is a superstition. This is a superstition that existed in the ancient Near East that Jacob believed, but I want to jump ahead and give Jacob the benefit of the doubt here. Flip over with me to Genesis 31, picking it up on verse 6. Genesis 31, verse 6. You know that I've worked for your father. Jacob is speaking to Laban's daughters. Father, with my own strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. It is from this verse that we know that eventually Jacob does give credit to God for the blessing that he receives in all of these animals. And the final verse that we have, in this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. This week has been very much a dive into a look at the culture of that day, at the culture of the ancient Near East in which Jacob lived. And we see a drastic difference from today. And thankfully, women are not treated in the same way that they were then. Women are not valued in the same way that they were then. And we are the better for it. But we also do learn from this, God's hand is clearly involved, as we've discussed over and over again. God's hand is watching over and ensuring that the Abrahamic blessing is going to continue. And we're going to wrap up. We're going to continue talking about Jacob in the next few chapters, and then we're going to start talking about Joseph. And Joseph is going to have a massive chunk of Genesis as we look at Joseph and the process of Israel going down into Egypt. Why don't you pray with me? Lord, thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you that you love us. Thank you that you have captured this in time so that we can see from a historical standpoint what the culture was like and what the customs were like. Thank you, Lord, that women are not valued in the same way that they were back then. And that they are not valued based simply on their status of being married or on their ability to bear children. Lord, I do want to pray right now for those women who and families, for those husbands and wives that want and are trying to have children. I pray, Lord, that you would bless them with children, and Lord, if it's not in their future, that you will give them wisdom and insight. And lead their path and guide them and give them peace, knowing that you are sovereign and that you love them. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Awesome, guys. A lot to cover. I know we went long on this. Thank you for hanging in there. And I'll see you next week as we dig in to the next chapter in Genesis.